Have you ever awakened at 3 in the morning with no alarm set and felt as though something invisible was calling to you from the darkness? And you knew, without understanding how you knew, that this moment held a power that daylight could not contain. And perhaps you dismissed it as restless sleep. Or perhaps you lay there sensing that the universe itself was trying to whisper something sacred into your consciousness while the world around you slept in unknowing silence. There is an ancient prayer that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered in 1912 during her deepest spiritual crisis, when she found herself alone in her Manhattan apartment at exactly 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. And she would later write that this prayer came to her not from books or teachers, but from what she called the invisible realm, where all truth waits to be claimed by those who dare to listen when the world grows quiet enough for heaven to speak. This prayer has remained hidden for over a century, known only to a select few who understood its power to unlock blessings that have been waiting in the spiritual realm for the exact moment when a soul becomes ready to receive what has always belonged to them. And tonight, as you listen to these words, whether you remain awake or drift into the sacred space between waking and sleeping, this prayer will enter your consciousness and begin its work of revealing what has always been yours by divine right. You can close your eyes now, and everything that needs to happen will happen while you rest, because the part of you that truly hears these words never sleeps, and it recognizes truth, even when your thinking mind has surrendered to the gentle pull of slumber. And what I am about to share with you will work whether you believe it or not, whether you understand it or not, whether you remember every word or forget them all, because truth operates beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. Her name was Barbara, and she was 53 years old when she first encountered this ancient prayer on a cold February morning in Detroit, Michigan, where she had lived her entire life working as a secretary in a downtown office building that smelled of old coffee and industrial carpet. And she had awakened at 3:14 in the morning, not by choice, but because her mind was racing with worry about the eviction notice she had received the day before, demanding $847 in back rent within 72 hours. Or she would lose the small apartment where she had raised her 2 children after her husband left her. 12 years earlier, Barbara sat on the edge of her bed in the darkness, feeling the cold hardwood floor beneath her bare feet and listening to the distant hum of traffic on the interstate, while her heart pounded with the kind of fear that makes your chest feel hollow and your breathing shallow. And she had exactly $23 in her checking account and no family to turn to because her parents had passed away within 6 months of each other the year before, leaving her truly alone in a way she had never experienced, even during the loneliest nights of her marriage. She had been searching online for spiritual help when she stumbled upon a video about Florence Scovel Shinn, and something in the woman's voice, speaking across more than a century, made Barbara pause and listen as the narrator explained that there was a prayer so powerful that it could shift reality itself, but that it had to be spoken at precisely 3 in the morning, when the veil between the seen and unseen worlds grows thin enough for divine intervention to break through into human experience. That first night, Barbara felt foolish as she whispered the words she had written down on a piece of notebook paper. But by 3:21 in the morning, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest, like hot tea being poured into an empty cup. And she knew without doubt that something had shifted in the invisible realm, even though her physical circumstances looked exactly the same as they had 3 minutes earlier. The next morning at 9:37, Barbara received a phone call from her supervisor asking if she would be willing to work overtime for the next 2 weeks because their biggest client had requested her specifically for a special project. And when she asked about the pay, her supervisor mentioned that it would be double time plus a completion bonus that would total exactly $1,234, and Barbara felt her knees go weak as she realized this was nearly $500 more than she needed to catch up on her rent. By the second night, Barbara no longer felt foolish as she spoke the ancient prayer at 3:06 in the morning, and this time she felt not just warmth, but a sense of being held by invisible hands that seemed to lift the weight of her worries from her shoulders and carry them away into the darkness where they dissolved like sugar in warm water. And she slept more deeply that night than she had in months, waking with a sense of anticipation instead of dread. On the third morning, Barbara walked into her office building with a confidence she had not felt in years, and found a bouquet of flowers on her desk, with a note from a coworker who had been thinking about her struggles and had anonymously paid her electric bill for the month. And as Barbara read the note, tears streamed down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that she was being cared for by forces she could not see, but could no longer doubt. By the end of those 48 hours, Barbara had not only received the money she needed to save her apartment, but had also been offered a promotion to a position she had never even applied for, with a salary increase of $6,000 per year. And more importantly, she had discovered that she was not alone in the universe, that there were blessings waiting for her, that had always been waiting for her, and all she had needed to do was speak the right words at the right time, in the right way. 3 months later, Barbara would tell anyone who would listen that her life had changed completely, not because of luck or coincidence, but because she had finally learned to align herself with what Florence Scovel Shinn called the divine plan, where every need is already met, every problem already solved, every blessing already prepared, and waiting for the moment when we become willing to receive what has always belonged to us. If this teaching resonates with you, and if you feel you were guided here to receive what your soul has been seeking, then touch the subscribe button now. And it is not for me, but it is so that you receive each new teaching from Florence Scovel Shinn at the exact moment your soul needs it, and your subscription becomes a decree that you are ready to receive the blessings that have been prepared for you since before you were born into this lifetime. And in the comments, write only 3 words, which are, I am receiving now. And this is not an affirmation, but a decree. And when you write these words, you activate collective witness, and thousands of souls around the world write these same words. And the field strengthens for everyone who participates in this invisible community of receivers, and your words become part of a prayer that echoes around the earth. If you choose not to do this right now, that is perfectly fine, and your path is your own. But know that this is the moment of greatest power, when the teaching has just entered your consciousness, and your heart is open and your defenses are down. So do it if you feel aligned, and trust that your soul knows what it needs even when your mind hesitates. Now you can relax completely, and you do not need to do anything more, because everything I will share from this point forward enters you while you rest, and your subconscious is awake and alert, absorbing every word, even when your conscious mind drifts away into the healing space of sleep, where transformation happens without effort or struggle. Your subconscious mind is awake right now, listening to every syllable, and it knows how to apply these teachings in ways your conscious mind could never figure out, and it will work throughout the night, reorganizing your beliefs and expectations, and preparing you to receive the blessings that this ancient prayer will unlock in your life. If you fall asleep in the middle of this teaching, that is perfect, because when you wake, the seed will already be planted deep in your subconscious soil, where it will grow and flourish beyond anything you could accomplish through conscious effort alone. And sleep becomes a sacred state where divine intervention can work unimpeded by doubt or resistance. Florence Scovel Shinn was born into a world that was just beginning to understand the power of the human mind to shape reality through focused intention and divine alignment, and she lived during a time when the old certainties were crumbling and people were searching for new ways to connect with the sacred in their daily lives rather than only in churches. On Sunday mornings, she was raised in Philadelphia in the 1870s and 80s, when horse-drawn carriages still filled the streets and gas lights flickered in the windows of brownstone houses where families gathered around piano to sing hymns in the evenings. And she grew up in a household where her father read scripture every morning before breakfast, and her mother believed deeply in the power of prayer. But neither of them understood that prayer could be more than asking and pleading and hoping. When Florence moved to New York City in the early 1900s to pursue her career as an artist and illustrator, she found herself living in a world of creative possibility, where writers and painters and philosophers gathered in small apartments to discuss ideas that challenged everything their parents had believed about the nature of reality. And it was in this environment that she first began to experiment with what she would later call scientific prayer. The turning point in Florence's spiritual development came during the winter of 1912, when she was 37 years old and facing what seemed like an impossible situation involving her husband's gambling debts and her own failing health and mounting pressure from creditors who threatened to take everything she had worked so hard to build. And she found herself alone in her studio apartment on West 57th Street at 3:19 in the morning, unable to sleep and desperate for a solution. As she sat by her window, watching the empty streets below and feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life, Florence began to pray. But instead of asking for help in the traditional way she had been taught as a child, something new rose up from the depths of her being, and she found herself speaking words that seemed to come from a source beyond her ordinary consciousness, the Pi. Words that came through Florence that night would later become the foundation of everything she taught about the power of spoken word to transform reality. And she would write in her journal the next morning that she felt as though she had been given a key to unlock a door that had always been there, but that she had never noticed because she had been looking in all the wrong directions. This ancient prayer that Florence received was not ancient in the sense of being thousands of years old, but ancient in the sense of being eternally true and always available to anyone who knew how to access the frequency of divine receptivity. And she discovered that 3 in the morning was the optimal time for this type of prayer because it was when the collective human consciousness was most quiet and the interference from other minds was at its lowest point. The principle that Florence discovered that night and spent the rest of her life teaching is that your words are not descriptions of reality, but rather decrees that create reality. And when you speak from a place of knowing rather than hoping, when you declare what is true in the spiritual realm rather than what appears to be true in the physical realm, you activate forces that must respond to your command because you are working with divine law rather than against it. His name was Robert, and he was 61 years old when he first encountered Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings about the 3 a.m. prayer in 1915 at a small gathering in a Manhattan townhouse where she had been invited to speak about what she called the power of the spoken word, and Robert had attended the meeting reluctantly at the invitation of his sister, who had been encouraging him to explore spiritual solutions to what had become an increasingly desperate financial situation. Robert owned a small bookshop on the Lower East Side that had been in his family for 3 generations, and he took great pride in the carefully curated selection of literature and philosophy that filled the narrow aisles where customers could spend hours browsing through volumes that might change their lives if they found the right book at the right moment. But the neighborhood was changing rapidly, and fewer people seemed interested in books that required deep thought and careful consideration. For the past 8 months, Robert had been watching his savings disappear as he struggled to pay the rent on his shop, while sales continued to decline. And he had already let go of his only employee and was working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, trying to keep the business alive. But the numbers told a story he did not want to accept, and at the end of each month, he found himself deeper in debt, with fewer options and less hope. When Florence began to speak that evening about the power of prayer at 3 in the morning, Robert felt his skeptical mind immediately begin to construct arguments against what seemed like superstitious nonsense, but something in her voice and the absolute certainty with which she spoke made him continue listening, even as part of him wanted to leave and return to the practical world of inventory and profit margins. Florence explained that the reason 3 a.m. was so powerful for prayer was that it represented a time when most people were in their deepest sleep and their subconscious minds were most open to divine influence. And she said that when you spoke a prayer at this sacred hour, you were not just speaking to God, but you were speaking as God, speaking the truth about what already existed in the spiritual realm and was waiting to manifest in the physical world. She taught that the prayer itself was simple, but that it had to be spoken with absolute faith, not faith that it might work, but faith that it was already working and had always been working, because the prayer did not create new blessings, but rather acknowledged and claimed blessings that had been prepared for you before you were born and were simply waiting for you to recognize them and speak them into visible existence. Robert left that meeting with the words of the prayer written on a small piece of paper that he folded carefully and placed in his wallet. And for 3 nights he lay in bed thinking about whether he had the courage to get up at 3 in the morning and speak words that felt so foreign to his rational mind that had always relied on hard work and practical solutions rather than invisible forces and divine intervention. On the 4th night, Robert woke naturally at 2:58 in the morning and felt a strange pulling sensation in his chest, as though something was calling him to rise, and he found himself standing beside his bed without having made a conscious decision to get up, and he knew that this was the moment when he would either step into faith or retreat back into familiar despair. Robert spoke the ancient prayer for the first time at exactly 3:03 in the morning on a Thursday in November, standing in his bedroom in his nightclothes with his hands pressed together and his eyes closed, and the words felt awkward in his mouth at first. But as he continued speaking, he began to feel a warmth spreading through his body and a sense of rightness that he had never experienced in any church or synagogue. The prayer that Florence had given him was unlike any prayer he had learned as a child, because instead of asking for something, it declared something, and instead of pleading with God to help him, it acknowledged that help had already been given and was already manifesting in ways that he might not yet see, but that were as real and certain as the sunrise that would come in 4 hours. By the end of that first week, Robert noticed small changes in his bookshop that he could not explain rationally, and customers began coming in asking for specific books that he happened to have in stock, including some volumes that had been gathering dust on the shelves for months, and he found himself having conversations with people who seemed genuinely interested in the books he recommended, rather than just browsing without intention. Within 3 weeks of beginning the 3 a.m. prayer practice, Robert received an unexpected visit from a collector who had heard about his shop through a network of book enthusiasts. And this collector was specifically looking for first editions of spiritual and philosophical texts, and was willing to pay premium prices for books that Robert had considered nearly worthless because they had been sitting unsold for so long. By the end of 2 months, Robert had not only caught up on his overdue rent, but had also been contacted by a small publishing house that wanted to use his bookshop as a distribution point for a new series of books on metaphysical subjects, and this partnership provided him with a steady monthly income that allowed him to stop worrying about survival and begin focusing on serving his customers in the way he had always dreamed of doing. The transformation in Robert's business was remarkable, but the transformation in Robert himself was even more profound, because he discovered that he was not alone in the universe, struggling against indifferent forces, but rather that he was part of a divine plan where his success and happiness were not only possible, but inevitable. Once he learned to align himself with spiritual law rather than trying to force outcomes through human effort alone. Robert would later tell Florence that the 3 a.m. prayer had taught him the difference between working hard and working in harmony with divine will. And he realized that all his previous efforts had been like trying to swim upstream, while the prayer had taught him to turn around and swim with the current of divine grace that had always been flowing toward him, but that he had been too busy struggling to notice. This principle that Robert discovered through his experience with the ancient prayer is the foundation of everything. Florence Scovel Shinn taught about the relationship between human desire and divine provision, and she explained that we never have to create our good, but only recognize and claim the good that has always been ours by divine right, and is waiting for us to become receptive enough to receive it. The reason that 3 in the morning is such a powerful time for this type of prayer is that during these quiet hours, when most of the world is asleep, your individual consciousness can more easily connect with the universal consciousness, where all blessings already exist in perfect form and are simply waiting for the right frequency of receptivity to bring them into physical manifestation. When you speak this ancient prayer at 3 a.m., you are not trying to convince God to give you something, but rather you are acknowledging what God has already given and is already giving and will always give, because giving is the nature of divine love. And the only question is whether you are in a state of consciousness that allows you to receive what is always being offered. Your subconscious mind during sleep becomes a perfect receiver for this type of prayer, because it does not have the resistance and doubt that your conscious mind might create, and it can absorb the truth of your divine inheritance without questioning whether you deserve it, or whether it is really possible, or whether you have done enough to earn it, because desert and earning are human concepts that have nothing to do with divine law. The ancient prayer that Florence Scovel Shinn received that November morning in 1912 was not merely words arranged in a pleasing pattern, but rather a vibrational code that, when spoken with proper intention and at the correct time, creates a frequency that resonates with the spiritual laws governing manifestation. And her discovery that words are not descriptions, but rather creative forces that shape reality, would revolutionize how thousands of people understood the relationship between consciousness and physical experience. When Florence spoke about the power of the word, she was referring to something far more profound than positive thinking or wishful hoping, because she had discovered through direct experience that certain combinations of words spoken at specific times and with particular intention could literally reorganize the atomic structure of reality and bring into visible form what had previously existed only in the realm of infinite possibility. The word, as Florence understood it, was not separate from the thing it named, but was actually the vibrational essence of that thing made audible. And when you speak the ancient prayer at 3 a.m, you are not asking for something to happen in the future, but rather you are speaking into existence what already exists in the timeless dimension where all possibilities are held in perfect potential, waiting for the right frequency to call them forth. Sound itself is vibration, and vibration is the fundamental creative force of the universe. And when you understand this principle, you begin to realize that every word you speak is either creating harmony or discord in the invisible realm where your life circumstances are being formed moment by moment according to the vibrational patterns you are broadcasting through your thoughts, your emotions, and most powerfully through your spoken declarations. The reason that prayer is more effective than silent thought is that when you speak words, you are giving physical form to vibrational energy, and you are using your vocal cords and your breath and your entire body as an instrument through which divine creative power can flow into manifestation. And this is why Florence always insisted that her prayers be spoken aloud, even when no other human being could hear them. Her name was Patricia, and she was 57 years old when she first learned about the vibrational power of the ancient prayer from her daughter, who had discovered Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings while researching alternative approaches to healing after Patricia had been diagnosed with a condition that her doctors said would require expensive treatment that her insurance would not fully cover. Patricia lived in a small house in Portland, Oregon, that she had purchased 32 years earlier when she was working as a nurse at the local hospital, and she had always been a practical woman who believed in science and medicine and hard work. But the diagnosis had shaken her faith in the medical system, and she found herself open to possibilities that she would have dismissed as nonsense just 6 months earlier. The treatment that her doctors recommended would cost $18,400 out of pocket, and Patricia had been saving for retirement, so she had the money, but spending it would mean working for several more years instead of retiring at 60 as she had planned. And the thought of continuing to work in the high-stress environment of the hospital when she was already feeling exhausted and overwhelmed filled her with a dread that was almost as difficult to bear as the fear of her diagnosis. When her daughter Melissa explained the ancient prayer and the importance of speaking it at exactly 3 a.m, Patricia's first response was skeptical because she had never been particularly religious. And the idea that words could have healing power seemed to contradict everything she had learned during her 35-year medical career. But something in Melissa's voice and the obvious sincerity of her concern convinced Patricia to try the prayer for 1 week. On the first night, Patricia set her alarm for 2:55 a.m. And when it went off, she felt disoriented and slightly foolish as she stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face before returning to her bedroom, where she had written the prayer on a piece of paper and placed it on her nightstand where she could read it in the dim light from the street lamp outside her window. As Patricia began to speak the words of the ancient prayer, she felt awkward and self-conscious, as though she were performing in a play for which she had not properly rehearsed. But by the third sentence, something began to shift in her chest, and she felt a warmth spreading through her body that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room and everything to do with a vibration that seemed to emanate from the words themselves. The prayer that Florence Scovel Shinn had received contained specific phrases that acknowledged Patricia's perfect health as an already existing reality in the spiritual realm. And as she spoke these words, Patricia began to feel a tingling sensation in the areas of her body where she had been experiencing discomfort, and she noticed that her breathing became deeper and more relaxed than it had been in months. By the end of that first week, Patricia realized that she was sleeping more soundly than she had since receiving her diagnosis, and she was waking up with more energy and less anxiety. And when she returned to her doctor for follow-up tests, the results showed improvement that her medical team could not explain based on the natural progression of her condition. After 2 weeks of speaking the ancient prayer at 3 a.m., Patricia received a phone call from a medical research facility that was conducting a clinical trial for a new treatment for her specific condition. And they were looking for participants who met very precise criteria, and Patricia qualified perfectly, and if she agreed to participate in the study, all of her treatment would be provided at no cost, and she would actually receive compensation for her time and participation. Within 1 month of beginning the prayer practice, Patricia had not only found a way to receive the treatment she needed without depleting her retirement savings, but she had also experienced a significant improvement in her overall health and energy level. And most importantly, she had discovered that her body had an innate wisdom and healing capacity that could be activated through proper vibrational alignment. Patricia later told her daughter that the ancient prayer had taught her that healing was not something that happened to her, but something that she participated in through her willingness to align her consciousness with the perfect health that already existed for her in what Florence Scovel Shinn called the divine pattern, where every problem already has its solution and every need already has its supply. The vibrational power of the ancient prayer works because when you speak words that acknowledge spiritual truth rather than physical appearance, you are aligning your personal frequency with universal frequency. And this alignment creates a resonance that naturally attracts circumstances and opportunities that match the vibration you are broadcasting through your spoken declarations. During the quiet hours of early morning, when most of the world is asleep, and the electromagnetic noise of daily life is at its minimum, your words can travel further into the vibrational field and create stronger patterns of manifestation than they could during the busy hours of the day, when millions of people are broadcasting their own thoughts and emotions and words into the collective consciousness. The ancient prayer contains specific vibrational codes that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered through years of experimentation and refinement. And these codes, when spoken with faith and precision, create a frequency that resonates with the spiritual laws governing supply and demand and cause and effect. And when you speak these words at 3 in the morning, you are essentially tuning your personal radio station to the frequency where all good already exists. Your subconscious mind during sleep is particularly receptive to vibrational programming because it does not have the filters and resistance mechanisms that your conscious mind uses to protect you from information that conflicts with your current beliefs. And when you speak the ancient prayer just before returning to sleep, your subconscious absorbs the vibrational pattern of the words and begins immediately to reorganize your energy field to match the frequency of what you have declared. This is why Florence always emphasized that the ancient prayer should be spoken with absolute conviction, not because you are trying to convince yourself that it is true, but because it is true, and you are simply acknowledging a reality that exists, independent of your personal experience or current circumstances. And the more clearly you can speak from this place of knowing, the more quickly the physical world will reorganize itself to reflect the truth you have spoken. The power of decree differs from the power of affirmation, because affirmation attempts to create truth through repetition, while decree acknowledges truth that already exists and calls it forth into manifestation. And when you speak the ancient prayer at 3 a.m., you are not trying to make something true, but rather you are recognizing what is always true and aligning your consciousness with eternal spiritual law that operates beyond the limitations of time and space. The most profound teaching that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered through her work with the ancient prayer was that you do not attract what you want, but rather you attract what you are, and this understanding revolutionized her approach to spiritual practice because she realized that trying to manifest specific things without first establishing the identity of someone who naturally receives those things was like trying to tune into a radio station without first adjusting your receiver to the correct frequency. Florence taught that the ancient prayer was most effective not when it was used to ask for things, but when it was used to establish and confirm your true spiritual identity as someone who is naturally blessed, naturally provided for, naturally guided, and naturally protected. And she discovered that when people began to see themselves as divine receivers rather than human strugglers, their entire experience of life shifted dramatically and effortlessly. The principle of identity preceding manifestation means that before you can consistently receive the good that you desire, you must first become the kind of person who naturally attracts that good. And this transformation happens not through effort or struggle, but through recognition and acknowledgement of who you have always been. At the deepest level of your being, beneath all the layers of conditioning and limitation that you have accumulated throughout your lifetime. When you speak the ancient prayer at 3 a.m, you are not asking to become someone different, but rather you are remembering and reclaiming your true spiritual identity as a beloved child of the universe who is entitled to every blessing and who has been provided for since before you were born. And this remembering is what creates the shift in consciousness that allows your outer circumstances to align with your inner truth. His name was William, and he was 64 years old when he first understood the relationship between identity and manifestation through his experience with Florence Scovel Shinn's ancient prayer. And William had spent most of his adult life believing that he was the kind of person who had to work harder than others to receive less than others. And this belief had shaped every aspect of his experience, from his career to his relationships, to his health to his financial situation. William had grown up in a household where his father worked 3 jobs to support the family, and his mother constantly worried about money, and he had absorbed the unspoken message that life was difficult and resources were scarce, and that good things happened to other people, but not to people like them. And he had carried this identity of scarcity and struggle into his own adult life, where it had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. For 43 years, William had worked as a maintenance supervisor at a large manufacturing plant in Ohio, where he had earned respect from his colleagues and supervisors, but had never received the promotions or salary increases that he felt he deserved, and he had always attributed this to bad luck or office politics, without realizing that his deep-seated belief in his own unworthiness was broadcasting a frequency that repelled the very opportunities he claimed to want. William's financial situation had become increasingly precarious as he approached retirement age, and he realized that his pension and savings would not be sufficient to maintain even a modest lifestyle. And he had begun to experience anxiety attacks when he thought about his future, and he felt trapped between a job that no longer satisfied him and a retirement that he could not afford. The introduction to Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings came through his neighbor Dorothy, who had noticed that William seemed unusually stressed and had offered to share some materials that had helped her through a difficult period in her own life. And when Dorothy mentioned the ancient prayer and its power to transform identity, William was initially skeptical, but he was also desperate enough to try something that he would normally have dismissed as wishful thinking. Dorothy explained that the prayer worked not by changing external circumstances, but by changing the person who was praying, and that when your identity shifted from someone who struggled to receive to someone who naturally received, the universe had no choice but to reflect this new identity back to you through improved circumstances and opportunities and relationships. William decided to experiment with the ancient prayer for 30 days, and he set his alarm to wake up at 2:59 a.m. every morning, and he would sit on the edge of his bed in the darkness and speak the words that Dorothy had written down for him, and at first the words felt foreign and untrue, because they described a version of himself that he had never experienced. The ancient prayer contained phrases that addressed William as a divine receiver and a natural magnet for good and a beloved child of the universe who was entitled to abundance and joy and protection and guidance. And as William spoke these words night after night, he began to notice subtle changes in how he felt about himself and his circumstances. During the first week, William found himself standing straighter at work and speaking up in meetings where he had previously remained silent, and he noticed that his colleagues began to respond to him differently, as though they were sensing a new authority and confidence that had not been there before. And several people commented that he seemed more relaxed and positive than they had seen him in years. By the second week, William realized that he was no longer dreading his daily tasks, but was actually finding satisfaction in solving problems and helping his team work more efficiently. And he began to notice opportunities for improvement in the plant's operations that he had previously overlooked. And when he shared his ideas with his supervisor, the response was more enthusiastic than he had expected. During the third week, William received a call from the Human Resources Department asking if he would be interested in applying for a newly created position as a consultant to help the company improve efficiency across all of their facilities. And this position would allow him to work part-time with full benefits while earning more money than he had ever made in his full-time role. By the end of the 30-day experiment, William had not only received the job offer that would solve his retirement concerns, but he had also begun to see himself as someone who naturally attracted good opportunities. And this shift in identity had affected every area of his life, from his health, which had improved dramatically, to his relationships, which had become more harmonious and supportive. William realized that for most of his life, he had been trying to improve his circumstances while maintaining the identity of someone who deserved difficult circumstances, and this contradiction had kept him trapped in a cycle of struggle that could only be broken by changing who he believed himself to be at the most fundamental level. The ancient prayer had worked for William not by changing the external world, but by revealing his true spiritual identity as someone who was naturally blessed and provided for, and when he began to live from this identity rather than from his old identity of scarcity and struggle, the world around him had no choice but to reflect this new truth back to him. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that spiritual identity is not something you create, but something you discover, and the ancient prayer serves as a tool for remembering and reclaiming the truth of who you have always been beneath all the false beliefs and limiting thoughts that have obscured your divine nature and separated you from your natural inheritance of peace and prosperity and joy. The power of speaking the ancient prayer at 3 a.m. lies partly in the fact that during these quiet hours, when your conscious mind is less active and your defenses are down, you can more easily access the deeper levels of consciousness where your true identity resides, waiting to be acknowledged and expressed and integrated into your daily experience. When you consistently align your spoken words with your true spiritual identity rather than with your current circumstances or past experiences, you create a vibrational pattern that attracts people and situations and opportunities that match this higher frequency. And this is why Florence always emphasized that the most important work was not outer work, but inner work, the work of remembering who you really are. Your identity as a natural receiver of good is not based on your personal history or your current achievements or your family background or your educational level or your social status, but rather on the simple fact that you are a spiritual being having a human experience. And as a spiritual being, you are connected to infinite source, which is always seeking to express itself through you in the form of everything you need to live a fulfilling and joyful life. The ancient prayer contains specific identity declarations that, when spoken with faith and feeling, create new neural pathways in your brain and new energy patterns in your subconscious mind, and these changes at the invisible level inevitably lead to changes at the visible level, as your outer world rearranges itself to match your inner conviction about who you are and what you deserve to experience. This process of identity transformation happens most effectively during sleep because your conscious mind cannot interfere with the programming that occurs when you speak the ancient prayer at 3 a.m. and then return to bed, where your subconscious mind spends the remaining hours of the night integrating the new identity patterns and broadcasting them into the quantum field where all possibilities exist simultaneously, even when people understood intellectually that the ancient prayer could transform their lives. Florence Scovel Shinn discovered that they often encountered internal resistance that seemed to work against their desire for positive change, and she realized that this resistance was not an obstacle to be overcome through willpower, but rather a natural part of the psyche's protective mechanism that needed to be approached with compassion and understanding rather than force or frustration. The resistance that people experienced when they first began working with the ancient prayer usually manifested in one of several predictable forms, and Florence identified these patterns through her years of counseling students and clients who came to her seeking guidance on how to maintain their spiritual practice in the face of doubt and fear and skepticism. And she developed specific approaches for working with each type of resistance without fighting against it. Florence taught that resistance was actually a sign that the prayer was working, because resistance only appears when something real and powerful is threatening to change the status quo. And the ego mind, which has invested tremendous energy in maintaining familiar patterns of thought and behavior, will always attempt to sabotage any practice that promises genuine transformation, because change represents a kind of death to the old identity, even when that identity has been causing suffering. The most effective approach to resistance, according to Florence, was not to try to overcome it or eliminate it, but rather to acknowledge it with kindness, and then surrender both the resistance and the desire for change to a higher power that could accomplish what human effort alone could never achieve. And this surrender was not giving up, but rather stepping aside to allow divine intelligence to work without the interference of personal will and agenda. Her name was Margaret, and she was 59 years old when she first encountered every form of resistance that Florence Scovel Shinn had identified during her years of teaching. And Margaret's journey through these resistances would become a perfect example of how surrender rather than struggle opens the doorway to miraculous transformation and lasting change in ways that human effort alone could never accomplish. Margaret had been recently widowed after 37 years of marriage to a man who had handled all the financial decisions and left her feeling completely unprepared to manage the practical aspects of life. And she was facing the possibility of losing the house where she had raised her 3 children because she could not afford the mortgage payments on her small pension. And the life insurance settlement was tied up in probate court with no clear timeline for resolution. When Margaret's sister Carol introduced her to Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings about the ancient prayer, Margaret felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. But that hope was immediately followed by a voice in her mind that said this was exactly the kind of foolish thinking that would lead her to ignore practical solutions and end up homeless and penniless and dependent on her children for support. On the first night that Margaret attempted to speak the ancient prayer at 3 in the morning, she found herself lying in bed wide awake at 2:45, feeling her heart racing with anxiety. And when the time came to get up and speak the prayer, she felt paralyzed by a fear that seemed to have no logical basis, but that filled her chest with a heavy sensation that made it difficult to breathe. This was the first resistance that Florence had identified, which she called the fear of power, because on some deep level, Margaret's psyche understood that speaking the ancient prayer would connect her with forces that could genuinely change her life, and change represented uncertainty. And uncertainty felt dangerous to a mind that was already overwhelmed by circumstances beyond its control. Margaret forced herself to get up and speak the prayer on that first night, but her voice shook, and the words felt hollow, and she returned to bed, feeling like she had failed some kind of test. And she lay awake for another 2 hours, questioning whether she was losing her grip on reality and whether grief had made her vulnerable to false hope and magical thinking. On the second night, Margaret woke up naturally at 2:58 and felt more calm as she prepared to speak the prayer. But as soon as she began the first sentence, a different kind of resistance emerged, and she found herself thinking about what her husband would have said about this practice, and she could almost hear his voice telling her that she was being ridiculous and that prayer was fine for church on Sunday, but that real problems required real solutions. This second resistance Florence had called the voice of authority, and it represented all the limiting beliefs that Margaret had absorbed from family members and teachers and religious leaders who had taught her to distrust her own spiritual instincts and to seek answers outside herself rather than connecting with the divine wisdom that lived within her own consciousness. Margaret pushed through this resistance and completed the prayer on the second night, but she felt conflicted and uncertain about whether she was honoring her husband's memory by continuing with the practice or dishonoring it. And this internal conflict made it difficult for her to speak the words with the conviction that Florence had said was essential for the prayer to be effective. By the third night, a new form of resistance had emerged, and Margaret found herself thinking about her neighbors and wondering what they would think if they knew she was getting up at 3 a.m. to speak prayers that promised to transform her financial situation. And she imagined them whispering about how grief had affected her judgment and how she was becoming one of those desperate people who turn to superstition when rational thinking fails. This third resistance Florence had identified as the fear of judgment, and it represented Margaret's concern about maintaining her social image and fitting in with the expectations of her community. And this resistance was particularly strong because Margaret had always prided herself on being sensible and practical, and the idea of being seen as gullible or naive felt almost as threatening as the prospect of financial ruin. On the fourth night, Margaret's resistance took the form of doubt about her own worthiness, and as she began to speak the prayer, she found herself thinking that maybe these kinds of miracles happened for other people, but not for someone like her, who had never been particularly spiritual or devoted, and who had spent most of her life focused on raising children and keeping house rather than developing any special spiritual gifts or insights. This fourth resistance Florence had called the unworthiness complex, and it was perhaps the most insidious because it convinced people that they needed to earn divine blessings through good behavior or spiritual achievement, rather than understanding that blessings flow naturally to everyone who is willing to receive them, regardless of their past mistakes or current limitations. By the fifth night, Margaret was feeling exhausted by the internal struggle, and she almost gave up entirely. But something made her get out of bed one more time, and as she began to speak the prayer, she noticed that a different kind of resistance was emerging. And instead of doubting the prayer itself, she found herself doubting her ability to speak it correctly, and worrying that she was mispronouncing words or forgetting important phrases. This fifth resistance Florence had named the perfectionism trap because it convinced people that spiritual practices only worked if they were performed flawlessly. And this belief created so much anxiety about making mistakes that it became impossible to relax into the flow of divine grace that the prayer was designed to invoke. On the sixth night, Margaret encountered what Florence considered the most dangerous resistance, which was the voice that told her the prayer was working too slowly, and that she should probably try something more dramatic or immediate. And Margaret found herself considering whether she should speak the prayer multiple times per night, or add additional prayers, or combine the practice with other spiritual techniques she had heard about. This sixth resistance Florence had called spiritual greed because it arose from the ego's impatience with divine timing and its desire to control and accelerate the process of manifestation. And Margaret realized that this resistance was actually a form of doubt disguised as enthusiasm because it implied that the ancient prayer, as Florence had received it, was somehow insufficient. On the seventh night, Margaret felt so overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of all these resistances that she sat on the edge of her bed at 3 a.m. and began to cry from sheer exhaustion and frustration. And she found herself saying out loud to the darkness that she could not continue fighting herself and that she was surrendering the entire situation to whatever divine intelligence had inspired Florence Scovel Shinn to share these teachings in the first place. As soon as Margaret spoke these words of surrender, she felt a profound shift in her chest, as though a tight band that had been constricting her heart for weeks had suddenly loosened, and she realized that all of her resistance had been coming from her attempts to control how and when and whether the prayer would work, rather than simply allowing it to work in its own way and in its own timing. When Margaret spoke the ancient prayer, on that seventh night, she felt for the first time that the words were speaking themselves through her rather than being forced out by her conscious will, and she experienced a sense of peace and rightness that she had not felt since before her husband's death, and she returned to bed feeling held and supported by invisible hands that she could not see but could no longer doubt. Within 48 hours of Margaret's surrender, she received a phone call from the probate attorney informing her that the insurance settlement had been released earlier than expected, and she would receive a check within 1 week for an amount that was significantly larger than originally estimated due to additional benefits that had not been included in the initial calculation. More importantly, Margaret discovered that the surrender she had experienced during her seventh night of prayer had created a permanent shift in her relationship with uncertainty, and she no longer felt the need to control every aspect of her situation, but instead found herself trusting that she was being guided and provided for by forces that were far more intelligent and capable than her worried mind. Margaret later told her sister that the ancient prayer had taught her the difference between giving up, which comes from despair, and surrendering, which comes from faith. And she realized that true spiritual power is accessed not through human effort, but through human willingness to step aside and allow divine will to flow through the situation without interference from personal agenda or timeline. The 7 resistances that Margaret encountered represent the most common obstacles that people face when they begin working with the ancient prayer. And Florence discovered that these resistances always appear in some form because they are the psyche's way of testing whether you are truly ready to receive the transformation that the prayer offers, and the key to working with resistance is not to fight it, but to witness it with compassion, and then surrender it along with your desired outcome to the divine intelligence that knows exactly how to resolve every situation in the most perfect way. During the quiet hours of early morning when you speak the ancient prayer, your subconscious mind is particularly receptive to the energy of surrender because sleep naturally puts you in a state of letting go and relaxation. And this is why Florence always recommended speaking the prayer just before returning to bed, where the energy of surrender can be integrated and amplified during the remaining hours of sleep. The ancient prayer contains specific phrases that help dissolve resistance by acknowledging that you do not need to understand how divine law works, but only need to trust that it is working. And when you speak these words with a heart that is open to surrender, rather than demanding specific outcomes, you create the perfect conditions for miraculous intervention in your life. Florence Scovel Shinn discovered, through her years of working with the ancient prayer, that the universe communicates with those who are aligned with divine will through a sophisticated language of signs and synchronicities. And she taught that learning to recognize and interpret these signs was essential for maintaining faith during the period between speaking the prayer and seeing its physical manifestation in changed circumstances. The signs that follow the ancient prayer are not random coincidences, but rather precise communications from the invisible realm where all change originates. And Florence explained that these signs serve multiple purposes, including confirming that your prayer has been heard and acknowledged, providing encouragement during times of doubt, and offering specific guidance about actions you should take or avoid taking as your situation resolves itself according to divine timing and wisdom. Florence identified 3 distinct categories of signs that people could expect to receive after speaking the ancient prayer. And she taught that understanding these categories would help prevent the common mistake of dismissing important communications as meaningless coincidences, or conversely, of reading significance into ordinary events that had no special meaning beyond their surface appearance. The first category, Florence called whisper signs, and these were subtle internal experiences, such as sudden insights or feelings of peace or unexplained confidence that came without any obvious external trigger. And she explained that these gentle signs were often the first indication that the prayer was beginning to work at the invisible level where all transformation originates before becoming visible in the physical realm. The second category she named messenger signs, and these involved external events or encounters that carried obvious symbolic meaning or provided practical guidance. And these signs often came through other people who would say exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, or through books or articles or overheard conversations that addressed precisely the concern or question that was uppermost in the person's mind. The third category, Florence called miracle signs, and these were undeniable manifestations of divine intervention that could not be explained through ordinary cause and effect. And she taught that miracle signs usually appeared when someone had reached a level of faith and surrender that made them capable of receiving and integrating dramatic positive change without being overwhelmed or destabilized by sudden transformation. His name was Charles, and he was 55 years old when he first learned to read the language of signs through his experience with Florence Scovel Shinn's ancient prayer. And Charles had been struggling with a business partnership that had become increasingly acrimonious and was threatening to destroy not only his financial security, but also a friendship that had sustained him through many difficult periods in his life. Charles owned a small restaurant in downtown Seattle with his childhood friend Michael, and they had built the business together over 15 years, creating a gathering place that was beloved by their community and provided both of them with a comfortable living and a sense of purpose and fulfillment that neither had experienced in their previous careers in corporate sales and marketing. The conflict between Charles and Michael had begun 6 months earlier when Michael had suggested expanding the restaurant into a second location, and Charles had expressed concerns about taking on additional debt and responsibility when their current location was successful and manageable. And what had started as a reasonable business disagreement had escalated into personal attacks and accusations that were poisoning their working relationship and threatening their friendship. By the time Charles discovered Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings, the situation had become so toxic that he and Michael were barely speaking to each other, except when absolutely necessary for business operations, and Charles was losing sleep and experiencing anxiety attacks and considering whether he should sell his share of the restaurant and start over somewhere else, even though this would mean giving up everything he had worked to build. When Charles's sister Janet told him about the ancient prayer and its power to resolve seemingly impossible situations, he was initially skeptical because the conflict with Michael felt too personal and too complicated to be solved through spiritual means. But Janet reminded him that Florence Scovel Shinn had taught that there were no problems too big or too complex for divine intelligence to solve if someone was willing to surrender the situation completely. Charles decided to experiment with the ancient prayer for 1 month, and on the first night after speaking the prayer at 3:12 in the morning, he experienced what Florence would have classified as a whisper sign when he felt a sudden wave of peace wash over him. And for the first time in months, he was able to think about Michael without feeling anger or resentment, and instead felt something that resembled compassion for his old friend, who he realized was probably as miserable as he was about their deteriorating relationship. The peace that Charles experienced that first night was so profound and unexpected that it convinced him to continue with the prayer practice, even though his logical mind told him that feeling peaceful about the situation would not necessarily lead to any practical resolution, and he wondered if the peace was just emotional exhaustion disguised as spiritual insight. On the third morning, after Charles had been speaking the ancient prayer, he stopped at his usual coffee shop on the way to work, and while waiting in line, he overheard a conversation between 2 women at the next table, and one of them was telling the other about a business partnership that had been saved when both partners agreed to bring in a neutral mediator who had helped them remember why they had become partners in the first place and focus on their shared vision rather than their current disagreements. This overheard conversation was clearly what Florence would have called a messenger sign, because it provided Charles with specific guidance about a potential solution that he had not previously considered. And the timing was too perfect to be dismissed as coincidence, since he had been asking the universe for guidance about how to repair his relationship with Michael without either of them having to admit fault or lose face. Charles felt inspired to research business mediators in the Seattle area, and he discovered that there was a woman named Dr. Patricia Williams who specialized in resolving conflicts between business partners and who had an impressive track record of helping people find solutions that preserved both their business relationships and their personal friendships. And her approach emphasized collaborative, problem-solving rather than adversarial negotiation. When Charles called Dr. Williams to inquire about her services, she mentioned that she had just had a cancellation and could meet with him and Michael the following week if they were both willing, and she offered to provide the initial consultation at no charge because she believed that most business conflicts could be resolved quickly if both parties were genuinely committed to finding a solution rather than proving who was right. Charles realized that this unexpected availability was another messenger sign, because Dr. Williams had told him that she typically had a waiting list of several months, but the cancellation had created an opening at exactly the moment when Charles needed it, and he took this as confirmation that the ancient prayer was orchestrating events behind the scenes in ways that his rational mind could not have planned or predicted. The challenge now was convincing Michael to participate in mediation, and Charles spent several days wondering how to approach his partner without triggering another argument, and he decided to speak the ancient prayer, specifically asking for guidance about how to communicate with Michael in a way that would open rather than close the door to dialogue and reconciliation. On the morning after Charles had prayed for guidance about approaching Michael, he arrived at the restaurant to find Michael sitting alone at one of the tables with his head in his hands, looking more defeated than angry. And when Michael looked up and saw Charles, he said that he had been thinking all night about how much he missed their friendship and how sorry he was that their business disagreement had caused so much pain for both of them. This moment of vulnerability from Michael was clearly a miracle sign, because it represented a complete shift from the defensive and combative attitude that had characterized their interactions for months. And Charles realized that the ancient prayer had been working not only on his own consciousness, but also on Michael's, creating an opening for honest communication that had not existed just days earlier. Charles was able to tell Michael about Dr. Williams and the possibility of mediation, and instead of rejecting the idea as he would have done weeks earlier, Michael immediately agreed and said that he had been hoping there was some way to resolve their conflict without destroying everything they had built together, and he admitted that he had been considering the same option of selling his share and starting over, but realized that neither of them really wanted to give up their shared dream. The mediation session with Dr. Williams took place exactly 1 week after Charles had first spoken the ancient prayer for guidance about approaching Michael. And during that session, both men were able to express their concerns and fears about the proposed expansion in a way that led to a compromise solution that neither had previously considered and that addressed both Charles's need for financial security and Michael's desire for creative growth. Within 30 days of Charles beginning the ancient prayer practice, he and Michael had not only resolved their business conflict, but had actually strengthened their friendship and partnership, and they had developed a new expansion plan that felt exciting rather than threatening to both of them, and included safeguards that addressed Charles's concerns about risk, while still allowing for the growth that Michael envisioned. Charles later told his sister that the ancient prayer had taught him that signs were not just confirmations that his prayer was being answered, but were actually part of the answering process, because each sign had guided him toward specific actions that were necessary for the resolution to unfold. And he realized that recognizing and following the signs was an essential part of cooperating with divine will rather than trying to force outcomes through human effort alone. The progression of signs that Charles experienced represents the typical pattern that Florence Scovel Shinn observed in people who were working effectively with the ancient prayer. And she taught that the signs always begin subtly with internal shifts and feelings, and then progress to external messengers and guidance, and finally culminate in undeniable demonstrations of divine intervention. The reason that signs are such an important part of working with the ancient prayer is that they serve as evidence that the invisible realm is responding to your declaration of faith. and this evidence helps maintain your confidence during the period when your physical circumstances have not yet shifted to match your spiritual declaration. And without this encouragement, many people would abandon their practice before the manifestation could become complete. Florence discovered that the 3 a.m. timing of the ancient prayer created optimal conditions for receiving signs, because during the quiet hours when most people are asleep, your consciousness is more receptive to subtle communications from the spiritual realm, and the signs you receive during this time tend to be clearer and more specific than those that come during the busy hours when your attention is scattered among many competing demands. Your subconscious mind during sleep continues to process and integrate the signs you have received, and often produces additional insights and understanding that become available to your conscious mind when you wake. And this is why Florence recommended keeping a journal beside your bed to record any dreams or insights that came after speaking the ancient prayer, because these nocturnal messages often contained important guidance about interpreting and acting upon the signs you received. The ancient prayer contains specific requests for clear and unmistakable guidance, and when you speak these words with faith and expectancy, you are essentially asking the universe to communicate with you in ways that you can easily recognize and understand, and this request is always granted, though sometimes the signs come in forms that require patience and spiritual maturity to interpret correctly. Florence Scovel Shinn's most revolutionary discovery about the ancient prayer was that it operated according to divine timing rather than human timing. And she learned through years of observation and experience that there was a specific temporal window within which the prayer's manifestation would unfold, and that understanding. This sacred timing was essential for maintaining faith during the apparent delay between speaking the prayer and seeing its results in the physical world. The temporal window that Florence identified was not arbitrary, but was based on spiritual laws governing the relationship between consciousness and manifestation. And she discovered that the ancient prayer typically began producing visible results within 48 hours and reached complete fulfillment within what she called the sacred cycle, which could last anywhere from 7 days to several months, depending on the complexity of the situation and the level of surrender achieved by the person speaking the prayer. Florence taught that time in the spiritual realm operates differently than time in the physical realm, because in the dimension where the ancient prayer does its work, all possibilities exist simultaneously, and the prayer's function is not to create something new, but rather to select from infinite possibilities the specific outcome that serves the highest good of everyone involved. And this selection process requires a certain amount of linear time to unfold in the world of form and sequence. The reason that the ancient prayer is most effective when spoken at 3 a.m. is partly because this timing aligns with what Florence called the universal prayer cycle. And she discovered that people around the world who spoke prayers of faith and surrender during these quiet hours created a collective field of receptivity that amplified the power of individual prayers and accelerated their manifestation in ways that would not be possible if someone were praying alone. Her name was Dorothy, and she was 62 years old when she first learned about divine timing through her experience with Florence Scovel Shinn's ancient prayer, and Dorothy had been facing what seemed like an impossible deadline because she needed to find a way to pay for her mother's extended care facility before the end of the month, or her mother would be forced to leave the only stable environment she had known since developing Alzheimer's disease. 3 years earlier, Dorothy had been caring for her mother at home until 6 months earlier, when her mother's condition had deteriorated to the point where she required specialized care that Dorothy could not provide, while also working full-time as a high school mathematics teacher. And the care facility where her mother was thriving charged $4,800 per month, which was more than Dorothy's entire take-home salary. Dorothy had applied for every form of financial assistance available, but had been told that her mother's savings disqualified her for most programs, even though those savings would be exhausted within 60 days at the current rate of expense, and Dorothy felt trapped between her desire to provide the best possible care for her mother and the reality that she simply did not have access to the money that would be required. When Dorothy's Colleague Sandra told her about Florence Scovel Shinn's ancient prayer and its power to resolve financial crises. Dorothy felt both hopeful and skeptical, because she had always been a practical person who believed in hard work and planning rather than what she considered wishful thinking. But Sandra's obvious sincerity and her detailed account of her own experience with the prayer convinced Dorothy to try the practice. For 2 weeks, Dorothy began speaking the ancient prayer at 3 a.m. on a Monday morning in October, and she had calculated that she had exactly 23 days before her mother would have to leave the care facility, and she found herself listening for signs and watching for opportunities with an intensity that she realized was probably counterproductive, because Florence had taught that the prayer worked best when someone could surrender the outcome completely to divine timing. During the first week, Dorothy noticed several small signs that seemed encouraging, such as a phone call from a distant relative who mentioned that she had been thinking about Dorothy's mother and wondering how she was doing, and an unexpected refund from her car insurance company for $73 that she had not been expecting. But these signs did not seem substantial enough to solve a problem that required thousands of dollars within a matter of weeks. By the end of the second week, Dorothy was beginning to feel anxious about the approaching deadline, and she found herself tempted to speak the ancient prayer more frequently than once per day, or to add additional prayers, or to take dramatic action, such as borrowing money against her house or withdrawing funds from her retirement account, even though she knew these solutions would create other serious problems. On the 15th day of her prayer practice, Dorothy woke up feeling more peaceful than she had since the crisis began, and she realized that worrying about the timing was actually a form of doubt that could interfere with the prayer's effectiveness, and she made a conscious decision to trust that if the ancient prayer was going to resolve her situation, it would do so in perfect timing, regardless of her personal anxiety about the deadline. Dorothy's moment of surrender came during her 16th night of prayer, when she found herself saying to the universe that she was releasing her attachment to how and when the situation would be resolved, and that she was willing to accept whatever outcome served the highest good, even if it meant that her mother would have to transition to a different care arrangement that Dorothy could afford. Within hours of Dorothy's surrender, she received a phone call from the director of her mother's care facility, asking if Dorothy would be available to meet the following day to discuss what the director described as an unusual opportunity that might be relevant to Dorothy's situation. And when Dorothy asked for more details, the director said that she preferred to explain in person, but that Dorothy should feel hopeful about the conversation. When Dorothy arrived at the care facility the next morning, she was introduced to Mr. James Patterson, who was a retired businessman, whose wife had lived in the same facility until her death 6 months earlier. And Mr. Patterson explained that he had been looking for a way to honor his wife's memory by helping other families in situations similar to the one he and his wife had faced during her final years. Mr. Patterson had established a private foundation that provided financial assistance to families who needed help paying for quality care for their loved ones, and he had asked the facility director to identify families who might benefit from the foundation's support. And Dorothy's mother had been selected as one of the first recipients of this assistance, which would cover the entire cost of her care for as long as she needed it. The foundation that Mr. Patterson had created was so new that Dorothy's mother was actually the first person to receive assistance. And Mr. Patterson explained that he had been guided to structure the foundation in a way that would help families maintain dignity while receiving support, and that all recipients had to do was submit a simple annual update on their loved one's condition and care needs. Dorothy later calculated that if she had tried to solve the crisis through conventional means, she would have had to work additional jobs or take loans that would have prevented her from visiting her mother regularly and spending quality time with her during her final years. And she realized that the divine timing of the prayer had provided not just a financial solution, but a solution that preserved what was most important to her, which was her relationship with her mother. The temporal window within which Dorothy's prayer was answered was exactly 21 days from her first night of speaking the ancient prayer to the resolution of the crisis, and Florence had taught that this 3-week period was common for prayers involving complex situations that required the coordination of multiple people and circumstances, and Dorothy's experience confirmed the importance of maintaining faith even when the deadline seemed to be approaching without any visible solution. Dorothy discovered that her anxiety about timing had actually been based on the false assumption that divine intelligence was subject to human deadlines and that God needed her worry and effort to ensure that everything worked out properly. And she realized that her surrender on the 16th night had been the key that unlocked the solution, because it demonstrated her willingness to trust divine timing even when it conflicted with her personal timeline. The ancient prayer had worked for Dorothy, not by creating new resources or opportunities, but by revealing resources and opportunities that had already been prepared and were simply waiting for the right moment to be made known. And this understanding helped. Dorothy realized that divine timing is always perfect, even when it appears to human perception to be cutting things dangerously close. Florence taught that the temporal window of the ancient prayer often includes what appears to be a crisis of faith when the desired outcome seems impossible given the time remaining. And she explained that this apparent crisis is actually the universe's way of testing whether someone is truly ready to receive the blessing they have requested, or whether they will abandon their faith at the first sign of difficulty. The reason that divine timing often seems to operate at the last possible moment is that this timing serves multiple purposes, including strengthening the person's faith and surrender, and ensuring that all elements of the solution are perfectly aligned, and removing any temptation for the person to take credit for the outcome rather than recognizing it as an expression of divine grace. Dorothy's experience illustrates why Florence always emphasized that working with the ancient prayer required not just faith in the prayer's power, but also faith in divine timing. And she taught that people who tried to hurry or control the timing of their prayer's manifestation inevitably created interference that delayed or complicated the very outcome they were hoping to accelerate. The 3 a.m. timing of the ancient prayer connects you not only with the quiet hours when your individual consciousness can most easily align with divine consciousness, but also with the temporal rhythms of the spiritual realm, where your prayer joins a continuous cycle of prayer and manifestation that has been flowing since the beginning of time and will continue flowing until the end of time. During the period between speaking the ancient prayer and seeing its manifestation, Dorothy learned to recognize what Florence called temporal signs, which were indications that divine timing was orchestrating events behind the scenes, even when those events were not yet visible. And these temporal signs included increased synchronicities and unexpected delays that later proved to be blessings and a growing sense of peace, despite unchanged circumstances. Your subconscious mind during sleep operates according to divine timing rather than human timing. And when you speak the ancient prayer at 3 a.m., your subconscious begins immediately to align your energy field with the perfect timing of your prayer's fulfillment. And this alignment continues throughout your sleep and influences your thoughts and decisions and actions during your waking hours in ways that support the unfolding of divine timing in your life. The most profound aspect of Florence Scovel Shinn's discovery about the ancient prayer was that it connected individual prayers with what she called the collective field of divine witness. And she realized through years of teaching and observation that when someone spoke the prayer at 3 a.m, they were not praying alone, but were joining their voice with thousands of other souls around the world who were also seeking alignment with divine will during the sacred hours when the veil between heaven and earth grows thin. Florence taught that the power of the ancient prayer was amplified exponentially when it was spoken by multiple people, because each person's faith and surrender contributed to a morphic field that made it easier for everyone to receive their individual blessings. And she discovered that people who understood this principle of collective witness experienced faster and more dramatic transformations than those who thought of their prayer as a private communication between themselves and God. The collective field that forms around the ancient prayer operates according to spiritual laws governing resonance and amplification. And Florence explained that when someone speaks the prayer with true faith and surrender, they create a vibrational frequency that attracts other souls who are vibrating at the same frequency, and this attraction strengthens the field for everyone, while also providing invisible support and encouragement to those who might be struggling to maintain their faith during difficult periods. Florence discovered that the 3 a.m. timing was particularly important for accessing the collective field, because this was when the largest number of sincere spiritual seekers around the world were engaged in prayer and meditation, and the concentrated spiritual energy created during these hours formed a powerful matrix that could support even the most challenging manifestations and the most desperate circumstances. The concept of invisible witnesses was central to Florence's understanding of how the collective field operated, and she taught that when someone spoke the ancient prayer, they were automatically surrounded by the loving presence of everyone who had ever spoken the prayer with sincere faith, and this invisible community provided strength and encouragement that could sustain a person through even the darkest periods of doubt or delay. His name was Thomas, and he was 67 years old when he first experienced the power of collective witness through his work with Florence Scovel Shinn's ancient prayer. And Thomas had been struggling with a situation that seemed too complex and overwhelming for any individual prayer to address, because it involved multiple family members and decades of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding that had torn apart relationships he had once thought would last forever. Thomas had 3 adult children who had not spoken to each other in over 5 years, following a bitter dispute over the care of Thomas's late wife during her final illness. And the conflict had escalated to the point where Thomas could not have all of his children and grandchildren together for holidays or family celebrations, and he felt heartbroken watching his family remain divided, despite his numerous attempts to mediate and reconcile their differences. The situation had become even more complicated when Thomas was diagnosed with a serious heart condition that required surgery and a lengthy recovery period, and he realized that he might not have many more years to spend with his family, and the thought of dying without seeing his children reconciled filled him with a grief that was almost unbearable, and made it difficult for him to find any hope or peace. Thomas's neighbor Helen had told him about Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings. After noticing that he seemed increasingly depressed and isolated, and when Helen explained the concept of the ancient prayer and the collective field, Thomas felt skeptical about whether spiritual methods could heal wounds that seemed too deep and too personal for any outside intervention to address. Helen suggested that Thomas try the ancient prayer for 30 days, and she emphasized that he should focus not on trying to change his children's hearts or force them to forgive each other, but rather on surrendering the entire situation to divine wisdom, while trusting that he was not alone in his prayer, but was being supported by countless other parents who had faced similar heartbreak and had found healing through spiritual surrender. Thomas began speaking the ancient prayer at 3:07 a.m. on a cold December morning, and as he spoke the words for the first time, he felt an immediate sense of being surrounded by invisible presences who understood his pain, because they had experienced the same kind of family heartbreak and had learned that love was stronger than any human conflict when it was aligned with divine will. During his first week of prayer, Thomas noticed that instead of feeling alone with his grief, he began to feel connected to what seemed like a vast network of souls who were also praying for healing in their families, and this sense of connection gave him strength to continue the practice, even when his logical mind told him that the situation was hopeless and that his children were too stubborn and proud to ever forgive each other. By the second week, Thomas began to sense that his prayer was being supported not only by other people who were currently facing family conflicts, but also by those who had successfully resolved such conflicts in the past, and this invisible community of witnesses seemed to be lending their faith and experience to Thomas when his own faith wavered, and encouraging him to trust that what seemed impossible to human perception was entirely possible for divine intervention. During the third week, Thomas felt guided to do something that he had never considered before, which was to write individual letters to each of his 3 children, not asking them to change or apologize, but simply expressing his unconditional love for them and his gratitude for the joy they had brought to his life and his acceptance of whatever level of relationship they felt comfortable maintaining with him and with each other. Thomas had never been comfortable expressing deep emotions in writing, and he found himself struggling to find the right words until he remembered that he was not writing these letters alone, but was being supported by the collective field of everyone who had ever faced similar challenges. And when he surrendered his desire to say the perfect thing, he found that the words flowed naturally from his heart onto the paper. Within days of sending the letters, Thomas received phone calls from all 3 of his children, and each of them expressed surprise at receiving such an open and loving message from him without any agenda or expectation. And they said that reading his words had reminded them of their own love for him and had made them realize how much energy they had been wasting on maintaining their resentments when life was too short and too precious for such divisions. The breakthrough came during Thomas's 4th week of prayer when his eldest daughter Jennifer called to say that she had been thinking about the family situation and had realized that their mother would have been heartbroken to see her children refusing to speak to each other, and she asked Thomas if he thought it would be possible to arrange a family dinner where everyone could be together without rehashing old grievances. Thomas felt his heart leap with joy when Jennifer made this suggestion, because it was exactly what he had been hoping for but had not dared to ask for directly, and he realized that the collective field had been working not only through his own consciousness, but also through the consciousness of his children, softening their hearts and opening them to possibilities that had not existed before he began praying. The family dinner that took place 5 weeks after Thomas first spoke, the ancient prayer was not perfect, and there were some awkward moments and careful conversations, but all 3 of his children and their spouses and his 6 grandchildren were together around the same table for the first time in over 5 years. And Thomas felt overwhelmed with gratitude as he looked around at faces that had been separated by conflict, but were now united by love. Thomas later told Helen that the most remarkable aspect of his experience was not just that his family had been healed, but that he had felt supported throughout the entire process by invisible witnesses who had provided him with strength and faith when his own resources felt inadequate, and he realized that no one who sincerely seeks healing for their relationships ever has to face that challenge alone. The collective field that Thomas experienced represents the hidden dimension of all authentic spiritual practice, and Florence taught that understanding this invisible support system was essential for maintaining faith during difficult periods when individual willpower and human effort seemed insufficient to address the challenges being faced. Florence discovered that the ancient prayer was particularly effective at connecting people with this collective field because it contained specific phrases that acknowledged the presence of spiritual witnesses and called upon their support and guidance. And when these phrases were spoken with genuine faith, they created an immediate connection with the vast community of souls who had successfully navigated similar challenges. The 3 a.m. timing of the ancient prayer maximizes access to the collective field, because during these quiet hours, the spiritual activities of sincere seekers around the world create a concentrated field of divine energy that can support even the most challenging manifestations. And this field becomes stronger each time someone new joins the practice with sincere faith and surrender. When you speak the ancient prayer at 3 a.m, you become part of an invisible community that transcends geographical boundaries and cultural differences and includes souls from every continent and every spiritual tradition who have discovered that divine love is the most powerful force in the universe, and that this love can heal any wound, resolve any conflict, and transform any situation when it is invoked with proper understanding and complete surrender. The collective witness that supports your individual prayer includes not only those who are currently speaking the ancient prayer, but also those who have spoken it in the past and experienced miraculous transformations. And these invisible witnesses provide a field of faith and expectancy that helps sustain you during times when your own faith might waver, and gives you strength to continue trusting in divine timing, even when your circumstances seem unchanged. Your subconscious mind during sleep naturally connects with this collective field and absorbs the accumulated wisdom and faith of everyone who has successfully used the ancient prayer to transform their lives. And this invisible transmission of spiritual knowledge helps prepare your consciousness to receive and recognize the blessings that are flowing toward you. even before they become visible in your physical experience. Florence taught that when someone truly understands that they are part of this vast spiritual community, they never again feel alone or abandoned in their challenges, because they know that their prayer is being supported by countless souls who have walked similar paths and found that divine grace is always available to those who approach it with humility and trust and willingness to surrender their personal will to divine wisdom. As we approach the sacred moment when you will receive the complete ancient prayer that Florence Scovel Shinn discovered during her darkest hour in 1912, it is important to understand that everything you have heard tonight has been preparing your consciousness to become a perfect receiver for the vibrational codes that are embedded within these ancient words. And your willingness to listen has already begun the process of transformation that will continue long after this. Teaching has ended. You have heard about the power of the word as a creative force that shapes reality through vibrational frequency. And you have learned that when you speak from a place of knowing rather than hoping, you align yourself with divine law and activate forces that must respond to your command, because you are working with spiritual principles rather than against them. And this understanding has already begun to shift your relationship with prayer from asking to declaring. You have discovered that identity precedes manifestation, and that before you can consistently receive the good that you desire, you must first establish the consciousness of someone who naturally attracts that good. And this transformation happens not through effort, but through recognition of who you have always been beneath the layers of limitation and conditioning that have obscured your true spiritual nature. You have learned about the nature of resistance and how it arises not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a natural part of the psyche's protective mechanism that must be met with compassion rather than force. And you have seen how surrender rather than struggle opens the doorway to miraculous intervention, because surrender allows divine intelligence to work without the interference of personal will and agenda. You have been taught to recognize the language of signs through which the universe communicates with those who are aligned with divine will, and you understand that these signs serve not only as confirmation that your prayer has been heard, but also as guidance for the actions you should take as your situation resolves itself according to perfect divine timing. You have discovered the importance of divine timing and learned that the temporal window within which the ancient prayer operates follows spiritual law rather than human expectation. And you now understand that apparent delays are often divine protection, ensuring that all elements of your blessing are perfectly aligned before manifestation occurs in the physical realm. You have been introduced to the collective field of spiritual witness that supports everyone who speaks the ancient prayer with sincere faith, and you know that you are never alone in your spiritual practice, but are part of an invisible community that transcends time and space and includes all souls who have ever sought to align themselves with divine will through prayer and surrender. Now you are ready to receive the story that seals everything you have learned and prepares you to become a living example of the ancient prayer's power to transform any life situation, no matter how hopeless or complicated it may appear to human perception when viewed through the lens of limitation rather than through the lens of divine possibility. Her name was Betty, and she was 58 years old when she faced what seemed like the perfect storm of catastrophic circumstances that would test every aspect of her faith and her understanding of spiritual law and her willingness to surrender to divine will, even when surrender seemed like the most foolish and dangerous choice she could possibly make in her desperate situation. Betty had worked for 37 years as a nurse in the intensive care unit of a major hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, where she had earned the respect of doctors and colleagues for her clinical skill and her compassionate care of patients and families during the most frightening and vulnerable moments of their lives. And she had planned to retire at 60 with full pension benefits and adequate savings to maintain a comfortable lifestyle. The crisis began when Betty was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that made it impossible for her to continue working in the hospital environment, where she was constantly exposed to infections that her compromised immune system could not fight effectively. and her doctors told her that she would need to take immediate medical retirement and begin an expensive treatment regimen that would cost approximately $32,000 per year for the foreseeable future. Betty's medical retirement meant that she would receive only 60% of her planned pension benefits, and her health insurance would cover only a portion of her treatment costs. And she calculated that within 18 months she would be forced to sell her house and deplete all of her savings, and she would still be facing years of expensive treatment with no clear prognosis for improvement or recovery. The financial crisis was complicated by the fact that Betty's elderly mother had moved in with her 6 months earlier after suffering a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and requiring daily assistance with basic activities, and Betty could not afford to hire professional caregivers, but was also physically unable to provide the level of care her mother needed while managing her own declining health. Betty's sister Linda lived across the country and had her own family, responsibilities, and could not offer more than occasional financial help. And Betty's adult son Mark was struggling with his own financial problems after losing his job during corporate downsizing. And Betty realized that she was facing a situation where every possible solution seemed to create new problems that were equally overwhelming. The emotional weight of these converging crises began to affect Betty's already compromised health, and she found herself experiencing panic attacks and insomnia, and a depression so profound that she began to question whether life was worth the struggle. And she seriously considered whether her mother and son would be better off if she simply gave up and allowed whatever consequences to unfold. It was during Betty's darkest hour at 2:37 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, when she could not sleep because of physical pain and emotional despair, that she remembered a conversation she had overheard between two other nurses who had been discussing Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings about the power of prayer to transform impossible situations, and Betty felt desperate enough to try anything that offered even the smallest possibility of hope. Betty found information about the ancient prayer online, and she was struck by Florence's teaching that the prayer worked not by changing external circumstances, but by changing the person who was praying, and that when someone's consciousness shifted to align with divine will, the external world had no choice but to reflect this inner transformation through improved circumstances and new opportunities. On her first night of speaking the ancient prayer at exactly 3 a.m., Betty felt foolish and almost hopeless because the words seemed to describe a reality that was so different from her current experience that they felt like lies or wishful thinking. But something in the depth of her desperation made her continue speaking, even when her rational mind protested that she was wasting precious time and energy. As Betty spoke the ancient prayer for the first time, she began to cry, not from sadness, but from a sudden recognition that she was not alone in her suffering, and that the words she was speaking had been spoken by countless other souls who had faced equally impossible circumstances, and had discovered that divine love was stronger than any human problem when approached with proper faith and complete surrender. By the end of her first week of prayer, Betty noticed that her panic attacks had decreased in frequency and intensity, and she was sleeping better, despite the fact that none of her external circumstances had changed, and she realized that the prayer was working first on her internal state before beginning to manifest changes in her physical situation. During her second week, Betty received an unexpected phone call from a former colleague who had heard about Betty's medical retirement and wanted to tell her about a new program at the hospital that provided work opportunities for retired nurses who could no longer work in clinical settings, but could contribute their expertise through telephone consultations and patient education programs that could be done from home. The position that Betty's colleague described was specifically designed for nurses with her level of experience and would allow her to work flexible hours from her home computer while earning enough income to supplement her reduced pension and maintain her health insurance benefits. And the timing of this opportunity seemed miraculous because the program was brand new, and Betty was among the first people to learn about it. During her third week of prayer, Betty was contacted by a social worker who had learned about her situation through the hospital's employee assistance program And this social worker specialized in helping families navigate the complex system of services available for elderly people who needed daily care. And she was able to connect Betty's mother with several programs that would provide in-home assistance at no cost because of her mother's limited income. By her 4th week, Betty realized that instead of facing financial ruin and impossible choices, she was actually in a better position than she had been before her crisis began, because the new work arrangement allowed her to spend more time with her mother while still maintaining her professional identity and contributing her skills in meaningful ways, and the treatment for her autoimmune condition was proving more effective than her doctors had initially predicted. The transformation in Betty's circumstances was remarkable, but the transformation in Betty herself was even more profound, because she discovered that what had seemed like the worst thing that could happen to her had actually been a doorway to a life that was more aligned with her deepest values and more satisfying than the life she had been living before her crisis. Betty realized that her years of working in the intensive care unit had left her, feeling burned out and emotionally exhausted, and that part of her had been longing for a change, but had been too afraid of financial insecurity to consider leaving her high-stress position. And her illness had forced her to make changes that she would never have had the courage to make voluntarily. 6 months after Betty first spoke the ancient prayer, she was healthier, happier, and more financially secure than she had been in years, and she had discovered that she was capable of trusting divine timing even in the most frightening circumstances, and that this trust had opened doorways to blessings that she could never have imagined or planned through human effort alone. Betty later told anyone who would listen that the ancient prayer had taught her the difference between control and faith, and that control was an illusion that created anxiety and limitation, while faith was a reality that created peace and infinite possibility. And she understood that her willingness to surrender her desperate situation to divine wisdom had been the key that unlocked solutions that were far better than anything she could have achieved through worry and struggle. The story of Betty's transformation represents the ultimate test of the ancient prayer's power, because her situation included every element that makes people feel hopeless, including health crisis, financial devastation, family responsibilities, and time pressure. And her experience proves that no situation is too complex or too desperate for divine intervention when someone is willing to surrender completely to spiritual law. Betty's journey from despair to gratitude illustrates why Florence Scovel Shinn always taught that our greatest challenges are actually our greatest opportunities, because they force us to let go of human solutions that are not working and open our hearts to divine solutions that are always available but can only be received when we stop trying to figure everything out with our limited human understanding. And now you will receive the same ancient prayer that transformed Betty's life and the lives of countless others who have discovered that speaking these words with faith at 3 a.m. creates a direct connection with divine power that can resolve any situation, heal any relationship, and transform any life when approached with proper understanding and complete surrender. You do not need to do anything except allow the words to enter your consciousness, whether you remain awake or drift into sleep, because your subconscious mind is perfectly capable of receiving and integrating these vibrational codes without any effort from your conscious mind, and the transformation will begin immediately and continue working throughout the night and for days and weeks to come. Breathe deeply with me now, even if you are sleeping, because your body knows how to respond to spiritual instruction, and your soul recognizes truth even when your mind is quiet, and the moment of the final transmission has arrived. And it is not your prayer, but the prayer that has been waiting since before time began, for souls who are ready to receive what has always belonged to them. Even if you are sleeping, something in you is awake right now. And this part of you that never sleeps, never doubts, never fears, is the part that will receive these words and carry them into the deepest chambers of your consciousness, where they will take root and begin immediately to reorganize your entire life according to divine pattern and perfect order. This part of you that listens beyond sleep has been waiting your entire lifetime to hear the words that I am about to speak, and it recognizes these words as the key that unlocks the door between the world of limitation, where most people live, and the world of infinite possibility, where all blessings already exist in perfect form, waiting to be claimed by those who know how to align themselves with divine law. Your breath is the bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind, and as you breathe now, whether you are aware of breathing or lost in the gentle drift towards sleep, your breath carries these words deeper than your thinking mind has ever reached into the sacred space where transformation happens without effort, without struggle, without doubt. Because in this space, only truth exists, and truth needs no proof, only recognition. Breathe in slowly now and feel the ancient wisdom entering your lungs, entering your bloodstream, entering every cell of your body. And as you breathe out, feel all resistance, all fear, all sense of limitation, leaving your body like smoke dissolving in the infinite sky of divine love that surrounds you always and supports you always. Whether you remember it or not, breathe in again, and this time feel the presence of Florence Scovel Shinn herself standing beside you as she stood beside countless souls who needed to remember their divine inheritance, and feel her gentle hand upon your shoulder as she prepares to speak through me the words that changed her life and the lives of everyone who received them with an open heart and a willingness to surrender to truth greater than human understanding. Now I will speak the ancient prayer in 3 waves, each one carrying you deeper into the sacred space where miracles are not unusual, but are the natural expression of divine love, operating through consciousness that has remembered its true nature and accepted its rightful place as a receiver of infinite blessing. First wave, and let these words wash over you like gentle rain falling on soil that has been prepared to receive the seeds of transformation. It is finished. The divine pattern for my life is now complete. Every need is now met from the infinite storehouse. Every door is now opened by the divine key. Every blessing is now flowing to me in perfect timing. It is done, and it cannot be otherwise. Second wave, and feel these words penetrating deeper into your consciousness, like roots growing down into rich earth where they will be, nourished by the waters of divine grace. It is finished. The divine pattern for my life is now complete. Every need is now met from the infinite storehouse. Every door is now opened by the divine key. Every blessing is now flowing to me in perfect timing. It is done, and it cannot be otherwise. Third wave, and now these words become living truth in the very foundation of your being, like seeds that have found their perfect soil and will grow without fail into the harvest of blessings that has been prepared for you since before you were born. It is finished. The divine pattern for my life is now complete. Every need is now met from the infinite storehouse. Every door is now opened by the divine key. Every blessing is now flowing to me in perfect timing. It is done, and it cannot be otherwise. Now the second sacred decree that establishes your true identity as a natural receiver of divine good. And this decree works not by making you into someone new, but by revealing who you have always been beneath every layer of doubt and limitation and fear. First wave of identity recognition flowing through your consciousness, like golden light illuminating every corner of your being. I am a natural receiver. Divine supply flows to me effortlessly. I have always been provided for. Every blessing seeks me as I seek it. The universe conspires in my favor. It is my nature to receive, and it cannot be otherwise. Second wave deeper into the core of your spiritual DNA, where this truth has always been encoded, waiting. For this moment of recognition and remembrance, I am a natural receiver. Divine supply flows to me effortlessly. I have always been provided for. Every blessing seeks me as I seek it. The universe conspires in my favor. It is my nature to receive, and it cannot be otherwise. Third wave, and now this truth becomes the governing principle of your entire existence, the foundation upon which every future experience will be built, according to divine law and perfect order. I am a natural receiver. Divine supply flows to me effortlessly. I have always been provided for. Every blessing seeks me as I seek it. The universe conspires in my favor. It is my nature to receive, and it cannot be otherwise. And so, it is sealed in your consciousness like a sacred covenant between your soul and the infinite source of all good. And this sealing cannot be broken by doubt or fear or any human circumstance, because it is written in the eternal record where divine truth is kept safe from every form of interference or opposition. And so it remains constant and unchanging, like the laws that govern the movement of stars and planets and seasons. Because spiritual law is more reliable than physical law, more dependable than any human promise, more certain than the sunrise that comes each morning without fail. And it cannot be otherwise, because divine truth, once spoken with faith, becomes the governing reality of your life, and all appearances to the contrary are temporary shadows that must dissolve in the light of what has been. Decreed by divine authority, operating through your consciousness, aligned with infinite wisdom. And so it is sealed, and so it remains, and it cannot be otherwise. And so it is. You can continue resting now, and you do not need to remember every word that has been spoken, because the words have already taken root in the soil of your subconscious mind, where they will grow and flourish beyond anything your conscious mind could plan or direct or control. And this growth will continue while you sleep and while you wake and while you go about your daily activities. Everything that needed to enter your consciousness has already entered, and everything that needed to be sealed has already been sealed. And everything that needed to be activated has already been activated. And the process that has begun tonight will continue working in your life for as long as you allow it to work. And the more you allow it, the more powerfully it will work. When you wake tomorrow morning, or whenever you next wake, you will be different. Not because something has been added to you, but because something false has been removed. And the truth of who you really are will shine more brightly through your thoughts, your words, your actions, and your expectations, and this light will attract to you everything that matches its frequency. You may not notice these changes immediately, because transformation often happens gradually, like the changing of seasons. But you will begin to see signs and receive confirmations and experience synchronicities that let you know the ancient prayer is working in your life, reorganizing your circumstances according to the divine pattern that was established before you were born. Some of you will see results within hours, some within days, some within weeks, but all of you will see results because divine law is absolutely reliable. And when spiritual principles are applied correctly, they must produce their intended effects, just as physical laws must produce their effects when the proper conditions are created. Rest now in the knowledge that you are beloved of the universe, and that every blessing you have ever desired already belongs to you, and is making its way to you through pathways that divine intelligence is preparing even as you sleep. And all you need to do is continue to be open to receive what has always been yours by divine right. It is finished, and so it is.